Welcome to Chapter 9. We're going to talk about energy and life. And here in this first section titled Chemical Energy and ATP, we're going to learn about that special molecule ATP because it is chemical energy. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. This really is probably one of the most important compounds available to cells that stores and allows for the release of energy. So adenosine triphosphate is actually made up of three sections, and we can break those down into these three chemical components, these three sections. We've got the first section here, which is our adenine section. So that's a special molecule called adenine, and then it is chemically bonded to a ribose here in the middle, this gray pentagon-shaped thing. It's a ribose because it has 5 carbons in it. That's why it's in a pentagon shape. And then there at the end on what looks to be somewhat of a tail, we have 3 phosphate groups. And that is why the term for ATP, adenosine triphosphate, that's why it's called triphosphate, because there are 3 phosphates. So tri stands for triphosphate, or stands for 3. That's the prefix for 3. Okay, so that indicates that there are 3 phosphate groups here on the end of it. Now, what if we wanted to change ATP into adenosine diphosphate with the prefix di instead of tri? If you know what the prefix di stands for, you might know the answer to this. So could we change this ATP into an ADP? And how might we do that? Well, we can definitely do that. This is an ADP, and this is what it looks like. And what you'll notice right off the bat is that there are definitely some similarities. There is still an adenine group. There's also a ribose in the center. But our tail now is missing one of its phosphates. It only has 2 phosphate groups instead of 3. Therefore, we call this adenosine diphosphate. Now, when a cell has energy available, it can store small amounts of it by adding phosphate groups to ADP molecules, and that makes those ADP molecules an ATP molecule. It's sort of like, when you look at ADP, it's sort of like it's a rechargeable battery, and it is what powers the machinery of the cell. So why would we think of comparing ADP to a partially charged battery instead of a fully charged one? Well, like a partially charged battery, ADP can store more energy than it currently has. And in the case of ADP, when a 3rd phosphate group is added, it stores this extra energy in the form of a chemical bond. So the fact that ATP can easily release and store energy by breaking the reforming bonds between the phosphate groups makes it exceptionally useful as a basic energy source for all cells. All right. How would you describe the light that's being produced by this flashlight? Well, you're probably thinking, well, that thing is pretty bright. Well, it is operating like a cell carrying out cellular activities. So what activity in the cell is like this device using energy from the battery? Well, if you're thinking that it's like a cell using energy from ATP as it releases a phosphate group, you would be right. So what activity in the cell is like the charger recharging the battery? Well, it's kind of like the process that adds a phosphate group to ADP, which can basically recharge ATP. And that's, of course, what this illustration here on the screen is illustrating for us. We have an ADP. We have a partially charged battery. That is the ADP. And it gets some energy in. And it can store some of that energy as a fully charged battery by adding this 3rd phosphate group to the ADP molecule, making it an ATP. And then that energy can be used with producing some energy out when the third phosphate group is removed from the ATP, at which point that ATP is again now an ADP. So cells aren't born with a nice big supply of ATP. They actually have to somehow produce it. So where do living things get the energy that they use in order to produce ATP? Well, it comes from the chemical compounds that we call food. ATP is like a fully charged battery. It can release energy when the bond between the second and third phosphate group gets broken. And so here you see the removal of the third ATP group, or the third phosphate group, from the ATP. Ultimately, nearly all life on Earth depends on the ability of autotrophs to capture and convert the energy from sunlight to synthesize molecules of high energy carbohydrates. We talk a lot about sugars, but it's also starches and lipids and other things. And these are molecules that can be used as food, both for the autotrophs, the plants, as well as for any organism that consumes those autotrophs or plants. So, what is the name of the process that autotrophs use in order to synthesize molecules of high energy carbohydrates by trapping light energy? If you're thinking he's talking about photosynthesis, yeah, you're right. I'm talking about photosynthesis. So where does this image here in the on the screen come from? What does this have to do with what we're talking about here when it comes to photosynthesis and ATP and all that stuff? Well, um, here we have a lion. I guess it's like looks like is that a jaguar? Yeah, I think it's a jaguar. It is chowing down on a deer, but that deer, what do deer eat? Well, they eat lots of grassy vegetation, and that grassy vegetation is all uh, photosynthetic. They use the sunlight's energy to convert molecules into sugars and starches and lipids and those sorts of things. So the cheetah or the jaguar, or whatever this is, actually, I think it might be a cheetah now that I think about it. The cheetah actually is going to consume sugars and lipids and all those carbohydrates from the deer that had eaten all of the plants. And that's where the deer got a lot of its carbohydrates from eating the plants. And the plants, of course, generated those carbohydrates from the sun. So the ultimate source of all energy on the earth is our sun. It is the ultimate source of it.